Hi, this is your host. Today's question is, can I create a video about the Cleveland torso murders? Just a reminder, this video does contain some disturbing content. Viewer discretion is advised. The killings in question took place in Cleveland, Ohio between 1935 and 1938. The case has also been referred to as the Kingsbury Run murders or the Cleveland Body Dump murders. On June 12, 1935, the police received a call that a man's body had been found dumped near the tracks of the New York Central Railroad. The body was badly decomposed, and it was difficult for the medical examiner to determine a cause of death. It didn't appear to be from natural causes, and there were no obvious signs of trauma. He ended up ruling the cause of death as unknown, and the case went cold. A few weeks later, on July 9th, another body was discovered just a few blocks away from where the first body was found. Again, this corpse was quite decomposed, but this time the medical examiner was able to tell that the man had died from a blow to the head. This man was identified as 33-year-old Edward R. Andrew. On August 6th, a third body was found, and again it was discovered close to where the other two bodies were found. The victim in this case was 47-year-old Thomas J. DeGrosse. His cause of death was also a blow to the head. After these three murders, there would be a bit of a lull in the activity of this killer. However, on December 19, 1935, the body of 28-year-old Stephen Hrobach was discovered in Kingsbury Run in Cleveland. On January 13, 1936, the body of 31-year-old Michael J. O'Brien was recovered from the same area. O'Brien's body was found wrapped in the same sheet as Hrobach's, and they were both discovered lying on top of each other. Unlike the other victims, these two men had been killed in a different location. Their bodies were found with their hands tied behind their backs, and evidence suggested that they had been strangled. So it seemed that this killer was changing up his methods. By now, everyone was starting to get really nervous because it seemed like there was a serial killer on the loose. People started avoiding walking alone at night, and cars were always being left unlocked so that if the killer needed to make a quick escape, he wouldn't have any obstacles. During the next few years, more and more bodies would be discovered, bringing the total number of victims to 12. The last known victim was a 24-year-old woman named Helen J. Bogan. Her battered body turned up on May 27, 1938. All of the victims were found in Cleveland, Ohio, except for one. That one exception was 46-year-old Frank S. Gillespie, who was discovered in nearby Euclid, Ohio. 5 of the victims had been identified as Polish immigrants, and 6 were native Clevelanders. One of the Cleveland victims was a black man. 2 victims were found to have been living in a hotel. 3 were homeless. 4 were unemployed, and 2 were married. As far as we know, none of the victims knew each other, and there doesn't appear to be any link between them aside from being unfortunate enough to run into a killer while he was working. Now, let's take a look at the crimes themselves. Aside from the fact that all the victims were found in the same general vicinity, there wasn't a whole lot of similarities between the crimes. Some of the victims had been beaten, others had been shot, some had been strangled, and a couple of them had even been stabbed. Most of them were fairly well dressed when they were found, and many of them still had their wallets and other possessions. But this does not mean that they were simply robbed and then killed by someone who was just trying to cover their tracks. These people were stripped of their dignity after they were killed. Many of them were found naked, and most of them were mutilated in some way. Several of them had their genitals removed. The killer must have been trying to conceal their identity because in several cases he either cut off his victims' heads or smashed in their skulls. In March of 1936, George Sullivan, who was the coroner at the time, told the press that he believed that only one person was responsible for all of these deaths. A year later, in March of 1937, a grand jury agreed with this assessment, but they couldn't come up with enough evidence to indict anyone. By 1938, the press had taken to calling the killer the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. They also gave him another name, the Cleveland Torso Murderer. This is the name that I'm going to use for the killer because I think it sounds kind of cool. The weirdest part about the Cleveland torso murders is that no one knows who the killer was or even what his motive was. There were plenty of suspects, but no one was ever convicted. In 1936, the police arrested a suspect named Richard Gaddis. He was convicted of raping one of the victims before she was killed, but he was never charged with murder. After his release, he moved to Florida and lived under an alias. He was suspected of killing several women in Florida, but he was never charged with those crimes either. He did go back to prison for burglary, and he died in 1971. Still, no one ever proved that he was the Cleveland torso killer. In 1959, a man named John C. Nail came forward and confessed to 11 of the murders. He said that he had acted alone in most cases, but he had an accomplice for the last 3. He said that he chose his victims at random. When he was questioned by the police, he did lead them to some of the murder weapons, but it turned out that they had already found most of them. Nail had also been convicted of raping one of the victims, and it seems that this is how he knew how to get the police to find these items. He was brought to trial for 2 of the murders, but both times the judge declared a mistrial. It appeared as though the prosecutors weren't doing a great job, and maybe they thought that Nail's confessions would save them. They asked him to take the stand and repeat his confession, but Nally refused. The prosecution was forced to drop the charges against him, and Nally went right back to prison for burglary. In 1965, a new suspect emerged. This time it was a dentist named Francis E. Smith. A former patient of Smith's claimed that he had heard Smith confess to the murders. Smith was already behind bars for killing his wife. In 1969, he was tried for the torso murders, but once again, the jury was unable to reach a verdict. In 1989, a man named Marvin J. Deming published a book called The Torso Murders: The True Story. In the book, Deming claimed that he believed not one person, but several people were involved in the killings. He said that the killer whom the media dubbed the Mad Butcher was actually a group of killers who worked together. In 2008, some bones that had been found in 1936 were retested. The bones were found to belong to 33-year-old Edward R. Andreo, the second victim. This was great news because now it could be proven that some of the victims had indeed been killed in the same place. However, the testing was unable to determine a cause of death or a DNA profile. In 2013, the case was reopened and investigators decided to test the victims' clothing. The results of the test linked Andreo and O'Brien. They determined that the 2 men had been killed in the same location. Unfortunately, this isn't much help because, we already knew that. In 2016, the FBI dug up and retested the remains of the youngest victim, Helen Bogan. They hoped that the new technology would allow them to extract DNA, but nothing usable could be recovered from her bones. So, as you can see, this case has gone cold yet again. Not only is it possible that we may never know who the Cleveland torso killer was, it's also possible that we may never know why he did what he did. Of all the crimes committed in Cleveland, Ohio during the early 1900s, the Cleveland torso murders remain the most gruesome. That's all the information I have for you today. If you have any thoughts on this case, I would love to hear them. Please put them in the comments below. And if you haven't done so already, please subscribe. I thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.